So welcome back to BIOB 105. We're going to continue our look at chapter 1 and look at the biotechnology industry and what makes up a biotechnology company and how it's different from a pharmaceutical company, and a little bit about starting a biotech company and sources of funding. So one of the things that you have to, of course, start out with for any business is an idea. You have a product you want to produce. You have a possibly a service you want to offer. You have a problem you want to solve for people. So that's the very first start. And a lot of times these are people that are either come from an academic lab or possibly another industry lab. And so they'll get a small business grant. There's a whole process for doing that. There's a process to get people to basically invest in you. So that's called venture capital. And another place to get the start in, especially once a company is sort of off the ground, is to get a research grant. And there's acronyms for various governmental agencies that offer grants. So the National Institutes of Health is a research arm of the government, particularly looking at human health, and quite a few branches. It includes allergy and infectious diseases, in various other institutes. So they things like child health, aging. There's a whole institute for cardiovascular health. So this actually is a set of labs. Most of them are in Bethesda, Maryland. We have one branch of NIH that's in Montana, and that's the Rocky Mountain Labs in Hamilton, Montana. And in addition to having their campuses for research, they also give grants to either academic labs or to industry. And so it's quite a process to go through to do a grant application and get funded, but they do support a lot of basic research that's led to some important breakthroughs in biotechnology. The National Science Foundation is another agency that supports basic research. And again, they invest and give grants to academic labs and also to industry. And interestingly, the Department of Energy, as you might guess, they might be interested in things like biofuels, but they also did quite a bit of work on the Human Genome Project. And then the U.S. Department of Agriculture, of course, is important in developing new crops and researching things. So they also give grants for biotech companies. So looking at the difference between a pharmaceutical company, let's say something like an Eli Lilly or Merck, or some of the other companies you might have heard of, versus a biotech company. And usually I think of them as sort of big and small. So pharmaceutical companies tend to be large, and they tend to be predominantly making chemical substances. So where do we get aspirin, and where do we get the compounds that lower cholesterol and things like that? So most of these are small molecules that can either be directly chemically synthesized or in some cases purified from living organisms, but a lot of times it's chemically synthesized. Biotech companies, on the other hand, are always working with living organisms, and many times it's bacteria, but it could be fungi like yeast, and sometimes it's human or animal cells or plant cells. And they also create a lot of products that aren't actually drugs or pharmaceuticals. So these are often things that are used in research. So there's a lot of research tools or materials. And we could also include, I guess, the aspect, there's some engineering and device development. So there's kind of an overlap between biotechnology and bioengineering in terms of what they do. So these are some of the biotech companies that were listed in 2017. And I put a list in the assignment that we're going to do on biotech research, where you're going to look at some of these companies. So I have a list for the companies from 2019 for last year. But Amgen is in the United States, and it's one of the largest. They're the ones that produce erythropoietin, which is used to treat anemia. They've also produced quite a number of other products. And I'm sure you've heard of some of these, probably heard of Novo Nordisk, but some of these you may not have heard of. So these are the big biotech companies. There's many companies that don't have their revenue listed in billions. They'd be lucky to have them in millions, if any. A lot of times biotech companies don't make much money the first few years. Then the pharmaceutical companies, I think you're probably more familiar with. These are things like Johnson & Johnson and Novartis and Pfizer and so forth. So I'm going to give you a chance to research some biotech companies, and also encourage you to look for companies that are located in Montana. So we have some actually pretty close by to us. So for the biotech company development, you have to have an idea, and then you have to figure out a way to sort of conceptualize that. So let's say, we had this idea, we needed to make insulin to treat diabetes. So how are we going to get the insulin gene? what cell are we going to put it into, how are we going to actually get that protein produced, how are we going to isolate it, and then if it's something that's going to be used in human health, then we have to do some research to see that we actually have effectiveness. So we have to do some research in animals, do some research in humans, and go through safety checks and so forth. And then finally, you have to get approval. And this is almost everything that's going to affect human health in some way is going to have some regulation. And you might imagine with pharmaceuticals, it's a large amount of regulation, particularly through the Food and Drug Administration. So it has to go through regulatory approval, and then finally the commercialization. You have to build a plant for that production. So there's a great deal of engineering in the background, getting the plants ready and the production lines and machines that you need. Agriculture would be somewhat along the same lines. I have something I want to do to that plant. I want to improve its ability to grow in maybe very arid environments. So I want drought tolerance. How can I do that? Can I get a drought tolerant gene from another plant into that plant? How do I get that expressed? And again, there has to be testing and development and then regulation. So there's the USDA and EPA are going to have that regulation. And then finally, how do we market that and commercialize that? So when you look at biotech companies and how they're regulated, there's quite an overlap. We have the Food and Drug Administration, as I mentioned, which is, if you're talking about genetically modified plants, they want to look at the human health side of it. Agriculture, of course, wants to look at how it's going to interact with other plants. And then the EPA wants to know the effect on potential for pollution or contamination. So there's quite an overlap in terms of what's looked at. If you look at things in human health, it's predominantly the the FDA that would be involved in that. So this is an example of the pipeline for drug development, and we're kind of seeing this right now with the vaccine development for COVID. Very similar idea that we have the discovery of the product itself. The preclinical work involves some kind of animals. So what works best? A lot of times mice or rats are used, but sometimes they can go to larger animals. In the case of COVID vaccines, they've gone to some non-human primates in some cases. So then really important when you start looking at humans, once you know it's safe in animals, then you have to do a safety trial. So phase 1 is usually what I think of as safety. And it's a small group of people, and you just want to see, did the people have any awful reactions to this, or was there any side effects from just using this compound, whether it's injected or taken orally or IV or whatever. Then the actual trial itself, there's 2 phases of what we call effectiveness or efficacy. And so phase 2 is sort of small scale, so it's on the order of just a few hundred people, and you look to see, did you get the response you wanted? So in the case of the COVID vaccine, did the people produce antibodies? Is there any evidence that their bodies are responding in a way that might protect them? And then finally, phase 3, and this is where we're at with some of the COVID vaccines, is we're literally in the thousands of people. You want to get people of different age groups, ethnicities, living in different parts of the world, but you want to make sure that you have enough people enrolled that you're representative of the human population. And now you're going to immunize, or if it was a drug treatment, and then you want to see whether or not you have the effectiveness. So this is kind of the pipeline. All this has to be gone through. All that data then gets supplied to the regulators, and they decide whether or not they're going to actually let you go forward with this. And what's the timeline on this? This is going to be, I kind of put this on the last, or the slide before this. How long does it take to get from an idea to a product? It's quite variable. In some cases you can fast track it in a couple of years, but there are cases where people have worked for decades on particular products. So that's why some of these products, when they actually do get to the market, are so expensive, because of the massive amount of work and money that's been put into this in the first place. So once we get to the development of the product and finally the manufacturing, there's a couple set of guidelines. There's good laboratory practice, which is a system that regulates the data that's collected, and there's a particular way that you validate all of your instruments and you make records so that everything can be tracked, and that's called GLP, or good laboratory practice. And then good manufacturing practice is, again, looking at a way to standardize procedures so that when you produce a batch of a product, you do it the same way every time. You validate the production equipment, you validate every single step of the production, and you know that the compound is pure and there's no contaminants and it's exactly what it's supposed to be. And these are really, really important steps, because we need to know that those compounds are produced in a way that's highly purified. So a little hard to see here, but the biotechnology company, so the CEO would be the person in charge of the whole company. There's probably a board of directors as well. But we have over here, we have the finance side. So who controls the money and the accounting of the running of the operation and any profits that are taken in, taking care of that. Then we have the operations. So I mentioned some of that quality assurance and ordering and material control and regulatory compliance. There's a lot of people involved in that. And then over here, we have some other sides. So I always kind of tend to think of the science side. So this is where the products are, sort of developed and the research is done to get the basic idea. But on the other side, if we do have something that's involving human health, we've got the clinical side. If this were going to be in agriculture, we'd have all that kind of regulatory aspect. And then eventually, if we have a product, we need to have sales and marketing. So we need to have communications. So running a biotech company, and not every company probably is going to have all of these parts, but as you get to the bigger companies, they are going to have these layers and maybe even other layers as well. So some careers, one of the things that we do in this class is get you ready for potential lab technician. And that's something that if you took this class plus a few others, you could actually have a certification that would let you go on to be a biotechnology certificate. And it would be sort of an entry-level lab, but literally working at the bench and either doing research or helping with some of the manufacturing process. The quality assurance side of it is important because, as I said, we need to make sure that both the research side and the production side is done very carefully. And so there's various levels of these. So lab tech, research associate would be a little bit higher. Then the scientist involved in development is probably a PhD level. So this is PhD level. The research associate would probably be either a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. And then laboratory technician could be an AA, maybe even a certificate, or possibly a Bachelor of Science. So those are kind of the levels that are available. And then of course, the clinical scientist would probably be either a PhD or MD, or sometimes it's both, MD, PhD, who are involved in looking at the human trials. And then engineering, there's a huge amount of engineering that's needed to figure out the process and again, how to make these equipment and how to validate the equipment and so forth. One of the other sides of this, and I know a lot of people that take this class really are doing it for a gen ed and want to just learn about biotech industry and what it means, but there are many areas that don't involve the science side of it. So we need administrators who help just kind of run the operations, the personnel and so forth. And that's not necessarily a PhD. You could be a science PhD, but not necessarily. There's sales and marketing, there's public relations, there's customer support. So people are going to call in, or let's say this is a drug that's going out to clinicians, they're going to call in, or maybe pharmacists are calling in for information. There's also legal side. For all of the materials, there have to be people that are the purchasers and buyers. We need people that write for the websites or write communications. We need graphic artists. These are just a few examples of areas. So there's many ways you could fit into this. So the first assignment for the course is going to be for you to research biotechnology companies. So I've made a list, and I posted this in our Eagle Online assignment, that you can look for companies. There's a great website through BioLink, which is a national resource for predominantly to your colleges, but for your colleges as well, to look for biotech companies. There are companies in Montana, so I put a link to the Montana Biotech Association. And so I'd like you to pick one, and maybe pick one outside of Montana, one inside Montana. It's just a suggestion. And write a paragraph or a couple paragraphs. And what I'd like you to do is describe what they do, what they offer, what is their product or services, and do they have a mission statement? Where are they located? Where was it founded? And then when you're in that company website, search for a job and see if there are jobs available. And you might have to go through a couple to find a job. And if so, what is the education that's required? Is there experience required? What are the job duties? What's the salary ranges? And so you might want to hunt around if you have an idea of kind of what area you're interested in. You maybe can find a job that's aligned with your particular interests. And so that's what I encourage you to do, is try to find something that would kind of relate to, what you could see yourself down the road. Could you end up working in a biotech industry with, the career interests that you have at this point? So I'm going to stop at this point, and we will continue on in lab. I put these links in the resources for the assignment, but we'll continue on and talk about some more of this when we meet together in lab. So hope you're having a good week, and I will see you soon. Take care.